Heinz-Wirtz knocks it in. Neil Cohen clears it. Duran heads it away with 35 seconds left. There will be some stunned folks around the nation when they see this score, but we're not surprised, are we?
Not at all.
On the far side, ball is shot. Cohen blocks Ercole. Into the crowd. Kick in Baltimore. 23 seconds left. Goodness gracious. Left side in the corner. Back to the point. Shot into the crowd. St. Louis goal kick. 17 seconds left, folks. This one is history.
Yes, sir.
You got to love these guys. This is not an expensive European soccer team. These are homegrown kids. Billy Phillips is an American in goal. Done an outstanding job tonight. 10 seconds left. Baltimore, one more rush. I don't think they can score 4 in 7 seconds. Shot in, left corner, 3 seconds, 2, around the goal mouth, and it's over. The Steamers have come into the Civic Center in Baltimore in front of a sold-out crowd of better than 11,600, and they have hammered Baltimore by a score of 7-3. What a performance tonight. Bob Keogh will head down to the floor now for our Star of the Game show coming up a little later on radio. But I'll tell you, folks, you have got a team to be proud of here tonight. They came in here, led it by a score of 2-1. Baltimore took the 3-2 lead. Don Ebert tied it up on the power play. And maybe the turning point of the game, Jeff Cacciatore's second goal of the playoffs, unassisted, into the empty net. When Baltimore took a chance and pulled their goalie for the sixth attacker with only seconds left in the first half of play, Cacciatore took it away from the magician Stan Stamikovic with a little magic of his own, and then took it down the floor into the empty net. The Steamers had the 4-3 lead at the half, added 2 in the third quarter, and the icing on the cake with only seconds left for a 7-3 victory. We'll be back with more from Baltimore in a moment. St. Louis wins it by 4, and this is St. Louis Steamers Playoff Soccer.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey there, how's it going, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this, of course, is Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And yes, make no mistake, that voice that you hear, the voice that you just heard, was a very familiar one to known very well to baseball fans all across the country, especially those in the Washington, D.C. area. His name is Bob Carpenter. He is the current television voice of the Washington Nationals Major League Baseball franchise, has been for quite some time. But as you'll hear in our conversation with Bob Carpenter in a couple of seconds, a lifelong journey of very interesting stops in and around professional and collegiate sports. And of course, we always dig real deep to find the excuses to talk to a very famous and enjoyable personality such as Bob. And we, of course, had the excuse to do so from some of his earliest days. And he was kind enough to allow us to drag him back into some of his beginning journeys in pro sports broadcasting. And what you just heard was a clip from one of those stops in the old Major Indoor Soccer League and the St. Louis Steamers in particular, where he was for many years the voice of the Steamers. We talked earlier to JP Dellacamera. He was a voice for a little while, and hopefully we'll get to talk to Joel Myers in another conversation, who was the voice for the Steamers for a season as well. But perhaps some of the more memorable moments of Steamers history was called by our guest this week, Bob Carpenter, and that was from the first game of the MISL Finals for the 1983-84 season that was played on, it was May 27th, 1984, and that game was live from the Baltimore Civic Center. And as you heard, the sort of final seconds of that first game, where the Steamers defeated the Baltimore Blast, going away 7-3, and was out of the chute, shall we say, well on its way to what they hoped was going to be their first ever Major Indoor Soccer League championship. But alas, I didn't mean to break it to you, but I'll do it gently. The rest of the series did not go St. Louis's way. As a matter of fact, Baltimore wound up winning the next game at home a couple of days later, 5-3, and then proceeded to go to St. Louis for 2 more games. Baltimore won both of those, the latter of which on June 6th, 1984. Stan Stamenkovic scored in overtime to send Baltimore back to the Civic Center, where on June 8th, they closed the deal and defeated St. Louis 10-3, winning the MISL Championship Series for the 1983-84 season, 4-1. However, we are not going to wallow in how close the Steamers got. There's no question that the Steamers were an amazing franchise in the Major Indoor Soccer League. And Bob Carpenter was there to call a whole bunch of games for it, as well as we'll get into in our chat in a couple of seconds here, his real first breakthrough in the pro ranks with the Tulsa Roughnecks of the North American Soccer League outdoor version, a little bit of indoor as well. And we'll get into all of that, the whole story of how Bob stumbled into the NASL, getting his first real pro broadcasting job, and how that sort of netted into MISL work with the Steamers. And we get into things like Bud Sports, the Anheuser-Busch sports production team out of St. Louis, and ESPN, and a whole bunch of things that ultimately led to a further and long-standing career in baseball across places like ESPN and now, of course, with the Washington Nationals. But lots of interesting stops along the way. But we're going to delve into some of those earliest stops with our guest, Bob Carpenter, coming up in just a couple of seconds. A fun and enjoyable chat, and you will enjoy it, hopefully, just as much as I did. As we get going, I want to say hello to a couple of our sponsors, of course, and encourage you to check them out and maybe give them a purchase or two. Why don't you? And we got a couple of codes for you too to do so. And the first that we want to call out is our friends at oldschoolshirts.com, and it's oldschoolshirts.com. And the promo code there is Good Seats. You're going to get 10% off all of your purchases there, and you're going to find some great high quality logoed T-shirts. One of which, of course, is featuring the St. Louis Steamers, a really nice sort of distressed-looking shirt. I think it's got more of the sort of modern logo attached to it, but it's a great way to remember the St. Louis Steamers franchise, 100% cotton. It's beautifully crafted and one of zillions of great designs and logos, not only of teams and leagues formerly with us or previously incarnated, but, old radio stations and shopping malls and all kinds of amusement parks, all kinds of other fun music venues, all kinds of stuff that you just may have forgotten. And our friends at oldschoolshirts.com are there to help you remember fondly and hopefully wear proudly in T-shirt form. Oldschoolshirts.com. Remember, use the promo code GOODSEATS and you will receive, courtesy of us, 10% off all of your purchases. And we thank our friends P.F. Wilson and his crew in beautiful downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, for sponsoring our little show here. And we thank them tremendously. And we thank you for giving them a try. Again, oldschoolshirts.com, promo code GOODSEATS. All right, well, let's actually get right into the conversation, shall we? Let's waste no more time. And here's a chat that we had with our new friend, Bob Carpenter. He, the voice of Major League Baseball's Washington Nationals, about some of his early stops in his illustrious broadcasting career. And here's our chat we had just a couple of weeks ago. This little show, in all its silliness, somehow over the last year and a half, as a sort of personal passion project, has oddly gained traction with people, for whatever reasons, who have their own sort of collective memories about teams and leagues and those kinds of things, defunct or otherwise domiciled, in their collective brains and their memories. I think some of it's childhood and some issues that haven't been resolved with all of us, but I can't speak to why people listen, but it seems to be growing. And sadly, you've been ensnared in my net in some of your early doings. Now, to the extent that you want to remember them, let's I'm more than happy to sort of tiptoe through them. But before we kind of get to where you are today, and your prolific baseball coverage, your time with the Nationals, et cetera, I want to maybe sort of regale our audience a bit with perhaps some of the earliest days to how you got to where you are today and how they know you. And interestingly, a lot of that actually kind of went through the world of soccer. But maybe even before we get there, I don't know, maybe our out of Washington, D.C. listeners might enjoy a bit of some of how you even got into this crazy business of sports broadcasting in the first place, if you don't mind.
Well, I always wanted to to be a sportscaster. I think when I was in high school, I did a lot of sports writing for our little in-house newspaper, and always interested in sports. Grew up in St. Louis, which obviously is a great baseball town, but maybe not as much as it used to be. But when I was growing up, St. Louis was an unbelievable soccer town because under the great coaching of Harry Keogh and some of the other gentlemen who came along, St. Louis University was a perennial NCAA soccer powerhouse, winning national championships on a very regular basis. So St. Louis was also a city made up of ethnic neighborhoods. And I grew up right on the edge of the hill, best known as where Yogi Berra and Joe Garagiola grew up. I grew up about 6 blocks away from Elizabeth Avenue, where they did in South St. Louis. There were 3 parishes that comprised the hill area. And, we grew up playing soccer. I mean, I remember playing in first grade. I remember it was a winter sport for us. We froze our rear ends off playing soccer in the late fall and into the winter before basketball started. And so I had a lot of roots in soccer. Didn't know that much about soccer internationally or anything like that, but I was always interested in the sport, and it was really cool because a kid that lived in my neighborhood, Vinny Lang, his father, Leo, played on the U.S. Olympic team, I think back in the 50s. So that was kind of a big deal for us, and, that's kind of how I had some roots in soccer. And I played with a couple of kids who went on to play professionally, most notably a young man that was a year younger than me in elementary school. We played together several years. His name was John Strumlaw, and John would later go on to play for the St. Louis Steamers of the Major Indoor Soccer League and the St. Louis Stars of the old NASL. So, a lot of soccer in my background. We played through high school, amateur soccer. And then when I went away to school, it was kind of unusual, Tim, because I went to UMKC to the start of my junior year to study broadcasting. Well, UMKC, which is the University of Missouri in Kansas City, was mainly a commuter school. It only had one dorm, and I was transferring up there over the Christmas holidays. I couldn't get in the dorm. They had no room. Right across the street was an NAIA school, a private Catholic school called Rockhurst College, which I think is now called Rockhurst University. And they had a really good soccer team. They had plenty of room in the dorms, and a lot of the UMKC kids who came in from out of town ended up living in the dorms over at Rockhurst, right across Troost Avenue from UMKC. So I was living at one school, going to another, but they were right across the street from each other. And they had a little campus radio station. I got on the air as a disc jockey. And then as I kind of got into my latter part of my junior year and into my senior year, I was more interested in broadcasting sports, and they weren't really doing that. So I got the permission of the manager, the GM of the station, who was a faculty member, to string a cable out to the bleachers in the spring, and we did the baseball games. We had a cable over in the basketball arena. We did some Rockhurst basketball games, and during the fall, we took that same cable and strung it across literally across left field of the baseball field, and up into the bleachers of the soccer field, which was right on the third baseline of the baseball stadium, if indeed you would even bother to call it a stadium. So I would sit up there with a clipboard, a microphone, a little, amplifier box, and just kind of announce the games. I'd get the rosters of the team that was visiting. I'd get the Rockers roster, got to know the coach and everything. And then in my senior year, they went to the NAIA playoffs down in North Carolina. We did those games. We had a blast following the team. And that's really when I kind of started cutting my teeth on actually doing play-by-play. None of it was live on the air except when the team was at home. When we were on the road, I'd take a big old Pioneer reel-to-reel tape recorder with me. Thing weighed about 30 pounds or more. And we'd take it along there, put it up on the bleachers, hope it didn't rain, and do those soccer games from up on the bleachers wherever we might be. Then we'd bring them back, and we'd play them back on Sunday evening during dinner hour while the whole school was in the cafeteria eating, because Rockers probably only had about 1,200 kids in school at that time. So that's kind of how I got started in soccer. But I always wanted to be a baseball announcer. Actually came to Tulsa in the spring of 1976 to be the number 2 announcer, no travel, home games only. And I had a sales job selling radio advertising during the day for the legendary owner of the Tulsa Oilers, A. Ray Smith. That was at that time the Cardinals AAA ball club. And that was the team that moved out of Tulsa because the stadium was falling down. They actually, this is crazy, absolutely crazy. They went to New Orleans for 2 years and played in the Superdome as the New Orleans Pelicans of the American Association. That team eventually moved to Springfield, Illinois, and finally found its way to Louisville, Kentucky, where it is to this day. And they were still a Cardinal Farm Club, and that's the team that set all the attendance records, playing on the old fairgrounds there in Louisville. Sure. So, that was kind of the start of my baseball career. 1978, the Tulsa Roughnecks came to town. I know I was the only guy in Oklahoma who knew how to announce a soccer game, because when the baseball team left town, A. Ray offered me less money to go to New Orleans than I was already making selling advertising in Tulsa, so I decided not to go with the baseball team, stayed around, did high school sports, football, basketball, you name it, whatever I could get my hands on. And the funny thing about that is about 6 months after I decided to stay in Tulsa, I met the girl who I married almost 40 years ago. So if I had left with the team and gone on to New Orleans, God knows how different my life would have been. But that's pretty much how I got started in baseball, and of course soccer when the Tulsa Roughnecks got here.
Well, all right. So let's unpack the Tulsa Roughnecks thing first, because I think a lot of people of a certain generation, especially those who were big NASL and then later MISL fans, probably got to know your voice best from some of those games, as well as some of the national spillover, I guess, in some of those environments. Mm-hmm. How did you discover, and how did you sort of get yourself in a position to get into the Roughnecks conversation? Was it more you finding it, or it finding you, or how did it all come about, the Roughnecks gig?
I think it was a combination of two things, because I was selling advertising, as I said, not really what I wanted to do. I was doing okay. People told me I was pretty good at it, but I was selling for a station that had, very, very low ratings, and it was a day-to-day struggle. I really got my joy from doing those high school games on Friday nights and on the weekends, football, basketball, as I mentioned. It's kind of funny. There's a little suburb of Tulsa called Sapulpa, Oklahoma. It's just about 10 miles west of where my house is right now, just outside of town. They had a little radio station called KXOJ, and a guy named Mike Stevens was the guy who ran the station and owned the station, ran it. And it was funny because he was my color man, but all he did was read commercials. He didn't provide any analysis at all. So I'd go do a Sapulpa High School football game on Friday night for $25. That was my talent fee. And he would sit there and not do anything while I was doing play-by-play. I was pretty much going solo with whatever notes I could get from, both coaches. And then during basketball season, at 5:30, I'd leave work early, about 4 o'clock, 4:30, drive over to Sapulpa. The girls' game was at 5:30. The boys' game was at 7, and I'd do 2 games on Friday night. I'd get $35 for doing those 2 games. And, we'd go to the state playoffs. I remember one year we went down to Oklahoma City and did the state playoffs, and a lot of the little towns didn't have radio stations that carried the game. Well, they had radio stations, but they didn't have any announcers. So Mike would sell those games to these little towns, and I remember a couple times in one day, he and I would do 8 basketball games in a row, working off the program names and numbers and just doing those games. So, that's what I really got interested in play-by-play. And that's why when the Roughnecks came to town, I basically walked into Noel Lemon's office. He was the new GM. That team had come from Hawaii. They were Team Hawaii out there, and they transferred to Tulsa for some reason. They found local ownership with Tom Keeter, who is the owner of a big bakery here called Rainbow Bread. I guess they were the Tulsa version of Wonder Bread. And he was the owner. Noel Lemon was the GM. And I just walked into their offices in February of 1978 and said, I know how to broadcast soccer. I know how to sell advertising. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll go line the field or cut the grass if you want me to. Well, that wasn't necessary because Skelly Stadium, where University of Tulsa played, had artificial turf. But basically, Tim, I walked into their office, waited, 15 or 20 minutes to get in to see Noel. He called Tom Keeter in while I was in there, and I walked out of there an hour later with a job, which I was very happy to leave my radio job selling advertising. So pretty soon, I'm the first voice, radio and TV of the Tulsa Roughnecks. The games were on the biggest radio station in town, KRMG, which was one of the big-time sports stations in Oklahoma. We were on the local ABC affiliate. Kind of unusual. We did radio for the home games and TV for the road games. And I was actually the analyst on TV with Chris Lincoln, who is the sports director at KTUL Channel 8. So that's how it all got started, with my basically, getting squatting rights in their office until somebody would talk to me. And it was funny because I literally did walk out of there with a job, and I even got a slight raise from what I was making. So it was interesting because I was doing the games, I was doing the program, helping our PR guy do Kick Magazine, which was our program that came out for every game. I was driving players around to all the little places around northeastern Oklahoma. We had a big soccer presence here among kids with the Green Country Soccer Association. This corner of Oklahoma is called Green Country. It's really green. We have a lot of lakes. It's a beautiful part of Oklahoma, not the Dust Bowl that most people think of when they think about our state. But we traveled around to all those little towns. We did clinics. We did appearances. Charlie Mitchell, a hard-nosed defender, one of my dearest friends ever, over the years. He came with the team from Hawaii. He was the captain of the team. He would later become the coach of the Roughnecks after he retired. Charlie and I basically wandered northeastern Oklahoma, and anywhere we could find a school that had kids who were playing soccer, Charlie would go do clinics. I'd put on a soccer uniform because I had played as a kid, and I'd kick the ball back and forth to him. He would show off his soccer skills. Some of the other players did that as well. And that's really how the whole thing got started here in 1978. I still remember the first game, the Detroit Express, who played in the Silver Dome up in Pontiac, Michigan. They came here for our first game of the season, and I think we drew maybe 4,500 or 5,000 people. The Roughnecks lost 2-1. Our only goal was scored by a future star of our team, Billy Caskey, who came over with Victor Moreland from the Glentoran Football Club in Northern Ireland. They were Belfast kids, rough and tumble Irish kids who got a chance to come over here and play. They were the two most popular players with Charlie Mitchell. Those three were our most popular players. And, Tim, that's how the whole thing got started back in 1978, and it kind of went from there.
So how quote unquote major league was all this experience? I mean, the NASL, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I'm sure it was sort of a little bit of both, right? I mean, obviously the NASL was sort of a white hot comet, especially around that time, but also wasn't necessarily, the established Major League Baseball presence that you were probably still, eyeing, for your future.
Well, I remember we marketed ourselves as Oklahoma's only major league sport, which in a way was true. Tulsa and Oklahoma City had minor league hockey. They both had minor league baseball, and obviously Oklahoma football, Oklahoma State football, Tulsa football, Arkansas, University of Arkansas is only 2 hours away. So, those were the main things around here. So it took a while for soccer to make those inroads. And, gradually the crowd started getting bigger. We were the smallest city in the league. We were smaller than Portland, Oregon, and certainly smaller then Seattle and San Diego, the Sounders in Seattle, the San Diego Sockers, the San Jose Earthquakes, the Chicago Sting, the Dallas Tornado. The St. Louis Stars had moved to Anaheim and had become the California Surf of all things. We had the Cosmos in New York and all that. And, of course, the Minnesota Kicks, they weren't really that close to us. Dallas was our number one rival, and Al Miller, who had won an NASL championship with Philadelphia, he was the coach down in Dallas. Tulsa and Dallas got a pretty good rivalry going, because one of the other guys who owned the Roughnecks was H. Ward Lay of Lay's Potato Chip fame, and he was based in Dallas. So the Tulsa-Dallas thing got to be a pretty good rivalry in the old NASL. We played at Skelly Stadium at the University of Tulsa, and they played at Ownby Field at SMU before they moved eventually to Texas Stadium, where the Cowboys played out there in Irving. So, those were fun days, but we were always the underdog. Noel Lemon was a fiery Irishman himself from Northern Ireland. He loved getting his name and the name of the team, of course, in the newspapers here. We had two newspapers here at that time. The Tulsa World was the morning paper. Tulsa Tribune was the afternoon paper. The Tribune went away, 25 years ago maybe. But, Noel was always trying to cook up some controversy. It was always us against them. That's the way we kind of portrayed the Roughnecks as the little guys in the league from the smallest market, because Tampa Bay, the Rowdies were drawing a lot of people. The Atlanta Chiefs were doing okay, the Cosmos, all these other teams. And it became kind of a fun thing. And the Roughnecks probably were a real pain in the butt to Phil Woosnam and the NASL office from time to time, because it seemed like there was always some kind of controversy involving Tulsa. If we lost a game, Noel would chase the referees off the field at Skelly Stadium, stuff that GMs really shouldn't be doing. And I'm working in the front office. I'm doing the games. I'm learning a lot about the business of soccer, and I learned a lot about how not to do things watching Noel work. He was a tough boss. He was tough on me, but there were times when he was very charming, and I felt like he was my best friend in the world. And then we'd lose a game on Saturday night, and then he'd be my worst enemy when I, got back to the office on Monday morning. It was a real roller coaster ride, Tim, and those were the early days. But here's something I will never forget. I think it was our maybe our third game of the season. We lost to Detroit, as I told you, and then the second team to come in was, I think they were called the Toronto Metros at that time. This is before they were the Toronto Blizzard, who Tulsa would later play in the Soccer Bowl in 1983 out in Vancouver and win that Soccer Bowl. They came in, I think Tulsa beat them 2-0 or 2-1. We had about 10,000 fans show up, and all of a sudden some people were starting to take notice. Well, the next week, we go to Giant Stadium in the Meadowlands to play the Cosmos, and the Roughnecks battle them to a scoreless tie for about 87 or 88 minutes. And in the closing minute and a half or so of the game, the Cosmos get a free kick right outside the penalty area, so the Roughnecks set up the wall. And I'm assuming it was Giorgio Chinalia who took the kick. It might have been him or Franz Beckenbauer. I think maybe it was Beckenbauer, the great German, who took the free kick. One of the guys, a rookie in our wall, flinched. The ball went right through his legs, and our goalkeeper was screened, and Colin Bolton was our goalkeeper. He came over from England. He couldn't see the ball. It went in the net. There were 78,000 people in the Meadowlands that day, and the Cosmos beat Tulsa 1-0. So here comes the David Goliath thing again. The Roughnecks lose only 1-0 in the last minute and a half to the mighty Cosmos. And then we kind of went on from there, and Tulsa started becoming a better soccer city as we got through that 78 season before we were finally eliminated, made the playoffs, were eliminated up at Old Metropolitan Stadium in Bloomington, Minnesota, when the Minnesota Kicks beat us 2-1, I think it was, and we had 2 goals disallowed on offsides calls. And you can imagine how the Tulsa people reacted to that, because we were David trying to beat Goliath again, and that didn't work out. That's how our first season ended, and Tulsa kind of became a pretty good soccer city after that.
Well, I was actually in that crowd of that Giant Stadium game, so I think I remember that goal, as a matter of fact, too.
I don't want to call him out, because he was an outstanding player. But, I love thinking about these kids. these American kids who came and played, because you had to have at least 2 Americans on the field at all times during that time. And I think he was from Hartwick College, which was either in New Jersey or upstate New York. His name was Billy Gazonis. And Billy, he was a fun kid. I really enjoyed Billy. He won the Herman Award, which is soccer's Heisman, of course. And the Roughnecks drafted him, and he was a rookie. And he and the kid next to him, I can't remember who the other player was next to him, had a little flinch, and then the ball got through the wall and beat our goalkeeper. But, Billy went on to have a really good couple of years with the Roughnecks. And, those American kids, Tim, had to be tough because they were playing with older, more established professional guys. Most of our team was from England or Ireland. Charlie Mitchell was from Scotland. And then, of course, we had a couple of Yugoslavians that came and played with us. Stojan Nikolic, who was a really hard-nosed defender. Ninoslav Zets, who was a little bitty guy who played the wing, who was just a magician with the ball. And that was the makeup of our team, with a couple of Americans sprinkled in here and there. I think there was a kid named Jimmy McCune, who was from Rider College. Billy Sauter, who was a Philadelphia kid, and I can't remember where he went to school, but these were kids who had to be pretty tough to survive in those days back in the NASL.
So what are you seeing then around sort of the rest of the league, and is it opening your purview? Obviously, you're getting smarter about sort of the both sides of the mic, shall we say. You're obviously in quote-unquote big league sports, right, especially in your town of quote unquote of Tulsa, right? I mean, it's almost like you've got a nice little purview from a smaller perch, if you will, to sort of bigger things in a broader landscape. I'm assuming you're getting some tapes out there too, and some notice from folks either elsewhere in the league or in other sports too. No.
Well, and the other thing was, with Channel 8 here, we also had a local cable system. It's part of the Cox Cable family now. But back then it was simply called Tulsa Cable, and they used to like to carry local sports too. And some of our soccer games, after they weren't on Channel 8 anymore, were on Tulsa Cable. And I remember going around the league and talking to some of the other PR guys. Paul Ridings Jr. was with the Tornado down in Dallas. Tom Meredith was with the Philadelphia team. And I would talk to these guys, and Jim Trecker was the guy in the league office up in New York who kind of oversaw all the PR, and all the, local PR guys would keep in touch with him. And, forged a personal relationship with those guys because I wanted to know what they were doing, that I could help make our situation better. I think we had a big advantage, Tim, actually being in a smaller market. Tulsa right now is a city of about 450,000, maybe 400,000, somewhere in that area. We have some big suburbs around, and our total metropolitan area is probably, 700,000, 650, something like that. And it was easier for us to get on TV and on radio because soccer here was a big deal. We had AA baseball here in the summer. And at that time, the Tulsa Drillers, who came in here via the Texas Rangers, they were the team that came in here after the Tulsa Oilers left. And so we had AA baseball, but, this so-called Major League sport, I think we did a pretty good job of involving the Green Country Soccer Association with the clinics and got the kids to this. We offered all kind of crazy discounts and freebies to get kids to drag their parents to the soccer game. And then we found out that some of the parents, most of all were football fans because, hey, we're in Oklahoma. This is primo high school and college, football country here. And then gradually I think we won over some of the adults to the game of soccer. So that's kind of how that whole thing happened. But I'd go around the league and talk to these guys, and they were like, how in the world do you guys get your games on the local ABC affiliate on TV, and how did you get this deal with the biggest radio station in town? Well, that was a byproduct of us being in a mid-sized market as opposed to Philly or New York or Dallas or Chicago, where most of those teams were on these obscure little radio stations, and some of them couldn't even get their games on television. There wasn't much of a national package of games, I don't think, until about 1979 or 1980. So we really had an advantage here of how we were able to market our team compared to some of those other teams who had more people from whom to draw than we did.
And unwittingly giving you probably some more skills and some more background and depth in terms of your overall resume, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Well, and then eventually, I ESPN signed on the air in the winter of 1979, if I remember correctly. Sometime around this time of the year. So if you think about that, that's 40 years ago. Because when I came out of college from UMKC as a December 1975 graduate, ESPN was still about 4 years away from even being a blip on anybody's screen. When I came out of school, my first job was a radio news job in tiny Jonesboro, Arkansas, hour from Memphis, where Arkansas State University is, and before I actually was able to make my way over to Tulsa to do some baseball, the minor league games that I talked about earlier. And, opportunities were limited. You either went to a small town and worked if you had a broadcasting degree, or if I would have decided to stay in Kansas City, I probably would have been pulling cable or pouring coffee or working in a mailroom at one of the local TV stations and struggling to get on the air. So, I got out of town and started doing all kind of different things I could do. So somebody at ESPN noticed me doing soccer, and I started getting some phone calls from them. And then, did a few indoor games in between seasons because they had an indoor league. The following year, they called me to do some outdoor soccer games. And I remember in 1982, when I got fired by the local ABC affiliate here, I was actually their sports director when Chris Lincoln left to take on some other opportunities. One day after I got fired, Ellen Beckwith, a dear friend of mine who was the talent coordinator at ESPN, and called and said, "Hey, can you come up here and spend about a week? Bob Lee is going to be our play-by-play guy. We want you to be our analyst, and you guys are going to sit in the studio for a week and a half or so and voice over the World Cup soccer games coming in from Spain." So, I'm like, hey, I'll go stay at the Holiday Inn in Bristol, Connecticut for a week and a half to get on ESPN. And that's what Bobby and I did. Bob did the play-by-play. I was actually his analyst. There just weren't that many soccer announcers around at that time. Seamus Mallon would become a great analyst with the Cosmos and eventually ESPN. I actually worked with Seamus during the 94 World Cup when it came here, and Bob Lee, I think, did 9 or 10 games, and I did 10 games in that World Cup with some other guys sprinkled in. I think Randy Hahn from the San Diego Sockers did some games. Roger Twibell did the ABC games that involved Team USA, which we never got to do on the ESPN games. So somebody at ESPN noticed me, and then I got a call from Jim Zrake, who to this day is a great friend of mine and probably had as much influence on my network career as anybody. And he said, "Bobby, we want to come on up to New York. I want you to meet Kate Koplovitz, who runs USA Network. We want you to do some things." Al Trotwig was doing some stuff for them, and then Al departed to go to CBS. And all of a sudden I was doing some national soccer games on USA Network, indoor and outdoor as well. So, in those early days, soccer was really big, even some college games for ESPN. I remember watching ESPN in the middle of the afternoon. They'd have a game from Seattle with Seattle Pacific University on there, playing somebody else from the West Coast. So soccer, while it was still in its infancy professionally in this country, it did become a vehicle of opportunity for me and some other guys whose names I mentioned. And then later when I was doing the St. Louis Steamers MISL games, whenever I'd have a conflict, Anheuser-Busch would call John Paul Della Camera to come in and do some games that I couldn't. I think JP was doing the Pittsburgh Spirit indoor games, and now his resume for the last 30 years has probably been the best of any American soccer announcer, or at least somebody doing soccer in America who doesn't have a British accent. And JP became a great soccer announcer while I kind of wandered off into baseball and other things. So those early days were fun. They were days of opportunity. There were a lot of hurdles that we had to jump over here and there, but I look back on that time in my career with a lot of fondness back in the late 70s and the early 80s.
I don't know if you wandered off, Bob, but so we did have a conversation.
I wandered off from soccer, I'll put it that way.
Okay, fair enough. Some would argue greener pastures. We had JP on a couple of months ago, and I think he directly attributes his opportunity with the Steamers as sort of a pivotal in his career. So
and we had that was my hometown, and Anheuser-Busch brought me back to do the Steamers. I think I did the Steamers from maybe 81 to 84, something like that. And then I got some college basketball opportunities and a little bit more baseball here and there. But we didn't call him JP. He was just John Paul back then. But I mean, he's just done fantastic, and I love it. I got to be honest. I'm being provincial here. I'm being a little American selfish here. But I always enjoy it when I turn on a game and JP's doing it, and it's not somebody they brought over from the other side of the pond to do American soccer. There's just something about our guys doing soccer and doing it well. And some didn't do it very well, but I would hope that I did it pretty well because I did get some opportunities. But JP, he's become the guy over the years, and I'm so happy that he has forged in that game the career that he has. But I tell you what, the whole St. Louis thing, Tim, is interesting because Anheuser-Busch had a president. His name was Denny Long. Denny Long loved soccer, and because of that led to Anheuser-Busch being a big sponsor in the early days of the NASL. You'd see Budweiser banners in most of the NASL stadiums. They sponsored indoor soccer, and it was kind of interesting because St. Louis never had, other than the Steamers, when they were drawing 18,000 a game to the St. Louis Arena for indoor, outdoor St. Louis just never had a great professional soccer tradition. They didn't have a good field. They didn't have a great stadium in which to play. They tried playing in Busch Stadium where the Cardinals and the football Cardinals played before they left for Arizona. But, they drew a couple of 20,000 crowds here and there. But it was Denny Long spearheading the whole thing at Anheuser-Busch that I think had a lot to do with the success of soccer in America. And we also had a sponsor here in Tulsa. Tulsa used to be called the oil capital of the world because so many oil companies were based here. And one of those was Getty Oil out of New York. They had a major presence here. They had a refinery here, and they were a big sponsor of Roughnecks soccer along with Anheuser-Busch and some of the others that were there. But I really think on a national basis, the NASL would never have made much headway and probably wouldn't have survived as long as it did without the support of Getty Oil. But a far and away number one was Anheuser-Busch because of what Denny Long did for the sport coming out of the brewery in St. Louis.
That's very interesting, and actually, ironically, Getty, obviously, the original money behind the original ESPN as well.
Exactly. I don't have inside information on what those two had to do with each other, but I do know without Getty Oil and Anheuser-Busch, soccer would have had no chance in a town like Tulsa, and I would think in other places around the country as well.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now back to our conversation. I also think it's interesting, too, that St. Louis, right, has, even still in today's Major League Soccer, which I know it's on their radar, they're still always in the mix, and there's always seems to be ownership issues or field issues and stuff. I mean, St. Louis is arguably one of the small handful of true cradles of soccer in this country, largely, born from ethnic and first generation immigrants and all that. And still St. Louis, doesn't have sort of the crown jewel of top tier professional soccer in this country, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, there's no doubt about the fact that St. Louis is the greatest soccer city in America that does not have a frontline major league professional team. It's one of the great mysteries to me. I know the stadium thing has been an issue, continues to be so, and I've seen the drawings online for 5 years of this wonderful looking soccer stadium that they want to build just west of Union Station in St. Louis. Union Station's the old train station that's on the fringe of downtown. It looks fantastic, but for some reason it just hasn't gone in St. Louis, and to me that's a big mystery.
All right. Just one last thing while we're talking about St. Louis is, can you just give us a little bit of a feeling, I guess, of what this sort of Steamers thing was like? Because indoor soccer, so ironically, right? This was the MISL essentially, became sort of this offshoot of an indoor game that you had experienced a little bit with the Roughnecks and the NASL. That really the NASL hadn't put a lot of effort into, was more of a sideshow. And here come Messrs. Foreman and Tepper to kind of make a league out of it, and then winds up eating the NASL, if you think about it, during the 1980s.
Yeah, it was interesting because, out in this area, we had 3 teams within a 250-mile area that were just drawing unbelievable crowds from indoor soccer. Now, and that was St. Louis, that was Kansas City, and that was Wichita. So maybe about a 350-mile radius. Because when we had NASL indoor soccer here in Tulsa, we draw 5,000 a game. The fans kind of liked it. It was a fun deal, but it was not a big deal. When the MISL came along, St. Louis playing that old barn over there on the Highlands old parking lot there by Forest Park, they were drawing 18,000 a game. There was a while when they were out drawing the Blues, who played in the same building. The Kansas City Comets, and Kemper Arena was brand new back then. The Comets were drawing 14, 15, 16,000 a game. And then you go out to this barn of an arena north of Wichita. It wasn't even in the city limits, I don't think. And Roy Turner, who had been the head coach, I think, of the Dallas Tornado in the outdoor league, and they were the Wichita Wings. And I want to tell you, I thought the nastiest place I ever had to go as a visiting broadcaster was when I did basketball for the University of Tulsa. We had to go to the Roundhouse in Wichita to take on Wichita State and those teams that were so tough to play back then. But when the Steamers went to the Kansas Coliseum, which I think was out like on some stockyards or something, and they made it into an indoor soccer arena, that was the toughest. Wow. I mean, you talk the toughest, and I'm trying to think of a way to describe this crowd without, saying the actual things they used to say to us as broadcasters and to our team. At times, it could be kind of vile, but I tell you what, they did an unbelievable job. They had this kid named Omar Gomez who scored goals like crazy. They had a kind of a midfield player named Ken Rotved who was as good as any indoor player I saw, who was strong. And I think he was from the Netherlands or from Sweden or something. And this kid was strong. He was just an unbelievable indoor soccer player. But I'll tell you, Tim, what really made St. Louis go was the fact that other than the goalie, the famous Slobo Ilievsky, who came over from Yugoslavia.
Best name ever in professional indoor soccer, Slobo Ilievsky.
Yeah, Slobo. I mean, his name was Slobodan, and everybody called him Slobo. And he was fantastic. I mean, diving saves, jumping all over the place, making saves you couldn't believe. And the St. Louis fans loved him. But other than Slobo and one or two other guys on the team, Tim, they were pretty much all St. Louis kids. Don Ebert was the striker. He was like the Phil Esposito of the MISL. He didn't look like the most skilled guy out there, but he'd get rebounds and put them in the net. He'd deflect the ball. He'd redirect. We had all these kids. We had Tony Bellinger, who was an American kid. Ricky Davis, who played for the Cosmos toward the end of his career. He came and played in St. Louis. Cacciatore, there were three Cacciatore brothers. I think a couple of them played for the Steamers. They were from my neighborhood in South St. Louis. Timmy Walters was a St. Louis kid. All these guys, and the fans absolutely fell in love with them and fell in love with this team. We had an African-American kid on the team who was a great defender. Carl Rose was his name. And our fans just adored these guys because they knew them. They knew who they were. And some of the St. Louis guys, Pat McBride, who was a very celebrated soccer player and coach out of St. Louis. He was the coach of the Steamers for a while. In fact, I remember one time we came back from a road trip that didn't go real well, and we were waiting for our bags at the carousel in the St. Louis airport, and before any bags came out, Pat McBride came riding up the belt from down in the basement. I don't know how he did it. Obviously, this is before 9/11 when you could pull off something like this. Before any bags came out, Pat McBride came out of the belt and through the little door and onto the carousel and went around a couple of times, and the guys were laughing so hard they were on the floor. And, that's just kind of funny stuff that used to happen, and, which you don't see anymore. But those were great days with the St. Louis Steamers. And the thing for me was, I was up in the press box on the east side of the rink at that time because that's where the Blues played, and I was sitting in the same seat that the unbelievably great hockey announcer Dan Kelly sat in when he did the St. Louis Blues games. And two guys who were local coaches, one was Bob Burnett, who is still living, and he was a superintendent of Afton Schools in St. Louis forever. He was my analyst when he couldn't do the games. Another great St. Louis soccer named Bob Kehoe, who died recently. Bobby would come in and be my analyst. My younger sister Mary was my stat guy sitting next to me, and we had a blast. But I'll never forget the first time I sat in that press box, and I'm thinking I'm sitting in the same seat where Dan Kelly sits to do St. Louis Blues hockey games, and that was a wonderful time for me, and that was a great time for soccer in St. Louis.
Well, so maybe you can one more soccer question, and then I want to use that as the segue to what obviously blossomed into finally getting into the baseball thing, and for good, arguably. I saw that I sent you a clip, I think, from the 1983 Soccer Bowl, which Tulsa won.
Roughnecks and Toronto Blizzard.
Right, but you were also mentioning on that broadcast that you had been doing some Team America broadcasts. So yeah. So how did that come out? Was that a Bud Sports thing?
Yes, sir. And I was already doing some stuff for Bud Sports. In 1983, the Washington Diplomats had folded. I remember going to RFK Stadium and playing those guys, and they had this striker from I can't remember if he was England or some other part of Europe. His name was Paul Cannell. He was a really good goal scorer, and he was kind of the guy who the Washington Diplomats revolved around. I think later Johan Cruyff might have come over and played there for a while, and I think he eventually landed with the team in Detroit. But that year, Washington, D.C. did not have soccer in the NASL. The Diplomats had gone away. I don't know if they moved or folded. I can't remember. But Anheuser-Busch decided to put the U.S. national team in training as a member of the North American Soccer League. They were called Team America. They played 16 games at RFK Stadium. They played 16 games on the road, just like any other team in the league. They were in the standings. I don't know if they were. I don't know how they were paying those kids. If they were the U.S. national team in training, I don't know if they were getting paid by the U.S. Soccer Federation or by the NASL or by Anheuser-Busch. But I think that was another Denny Long concoction. So they basically put a team in Washington. I did the games with Gordon Bradley, who had coached the Cosmos, who had coached in Washington, and would also be, because I know you saw the tape, he was my analyst in the booth for the NASL Soccer Bowl that year in Vancouver when Tulsa beat the Toronto Blizzard 2-0 in front of 50,000 fans out there in the Dome Stadium in Vancouver. And so we did 16 home games. I would fly up to Washington on almost a weekly basis, stay in a hotel, take the metro over to the stadium, do a Team America game. We would cover them like they were the hometown team. And I don't think they made the playoffs, because they were a bunch of kids playing against more established, talent. I think Jeff Durgan, who had played for the Cosmos, was on that team. I don't have a roster sitting in front of me of Team America, but, they were kind of the cream of the crop, and they were playing as an actual franchise in the North American Soccer League. That was the only year it happened, and that was in 1983.
Yeah, that's a very interesting asterisk in the history of the NASL. We actually had Rick Davis on sometime last year, and he actually says to this day he lost a friendship with Jeff Durgan because Durgan chose to play for his country, so to speak, and Rick decided that he thought he wouldn't get any better exposure and playing time than being with the Cosmos, and apparently a rift that continues to this day. But very interesting, very interesting story, especially given the sort of rocky road, I guess, of Americans' approach to World Cup soccer, and now we're in a lull again, and hopefully we'll maybe get out of it. But very interesting story.
Yeah, in fact, I'm just pulling up Team America on Wikipedia here, and now some of these names are coming back to me. I mentioned Tony Bellinger, who played for the St. Louis Steamers. He was on that team as a defender. Arnie Mauser was a goalkeeper. Paul Hammond, who was a very good young goalkeeper. Jeff Durgan was a defender on that team. Alan Merrick, who I remember from the Minnesota Kicks. Perry Vanderbeck. I'm just kind of looking at some of the other names. Rudy Glenn was a recognizable midfielder. Tony Crescitelli was a top-notch American defender on that team. Chico Borja. My goodness, I haven't looked at this list in 30 or some years. And then Greg Villa. I remember Greg Villa. He was a big physical forward. He was a St. Louis kid who played on that team. So it looks like they won 10 games and lost 20 games that year. They finished fourth in the Southern Division, and as I guessed a moment ago, did not qualify for the playoffs. But that was Team America back in 1983, and it looks like Alcides Panagoulias was the manager of that team, and they wore the red, white, and blue, and that was a really interesting experience. Little did I know that I would go back to RFK Stadium 11 years later to do several World Cup soccer games, and little did I know that in 2006 I would come back to RFK Stadium and work 2 years of baseball there, my first 2 years with the Washington Nationals, before they would open their new ballpark, Nationals Park, in 2008.
All right. Well, so with the remaining time we have left, and you've been exceedingly generous so far, and it's a shame that you can't remember any of these old details.
You're bringing stuff up for me, Tim, that I haven't thought about in 20 years. I'm telling you.
And sadly, that's kind of what we do on this little show, and I think that's actually why it's starting to resonate. I appreciate it to no end, and I'm sure our audience will as well. But so maybe you can explain with some elegance how your prodigious experience in this fledgling sport of soccer, right, both outdoor, indoor, how that kind of set the table for other gigs and other exposure that ultimately got you, I think, to maybe your original dream, which was sort of this baseball thing, right? Because you're getting national gigs in various sports, but I'm just curious as to how you ultimately sort of get there. It's more of a broadcasting process question more than anything else.
Well, and again, I have to go back to St. Louis, and I have to go back to Bud Sports. Because I talked about Denny Long and how much he loved soccer, and that's why Anheuser-Busch was so involved in soccer. There was a gentleman there who was a producer-engineer for the Cardinals, and his name will come to me here shortly. It's on the tip of my tongue. It'll come to me. But they brought me in to do MISL soccer, okay, for the St. Louis Steamers. And it's funny because back then, I always tried to be really versatile. I wanted to do baseball. That was always my thing, that I wanted to do baseball, and I wanted to do the Cardinals. I mean, I grew up in St. Louis. If you grow up in New York, you dream of being the Yankee announcer someday. You know, those things just kind of work like that. Never thought that I would really get the chance to do that. Tom Barton, by the way, was the guy whose name I was trying to think of. Tom was over their production at Bud Sports. Well, Tom met me at spring training one year when I was just down there hanging out. My sister worked for the Cardinals, and I went down to St. Petersburg one year. I'm just kind of hanging out and doing some reports back to my local radio station in Tulsa. And we met, and I told him, he said, well, you're Judy's brother? Judy Berta, my sister, pretty well known within baseball circles and with the Cardinals. And he says, what are you doing down here? I said, well, I'm doing some reports on, the Cardinals back to my radio station back in Tulsa. He said, well, what else do you do? I said, well, I do soccer, I do football, I do basketball, whatever. You name it, I can do it. I said, sort of boastingly, I guess. And he said, oh, really? So you think you can do anything? I said, yeah, I think if I'm given my chance, I can do anything. He said, well, send me some tapes. So I did. A couple of months later, he gives me a call. And this is interesting, Tim, because Anheuser-Busch, you have Budweiser, you have Bud Light, you have Michelob Light, you have all these different brands. And what Anheuser-Busch did, and I thought this was marketing genius back then, they would associate certain brands with certain sports. They would identify what their demographic audience was that they were shooting for, and they would market those different beers through those different sports, and they would televise some of those sports. So it was really crazy. I'd get a call from Anheuser-Busch. I never forget this. They said, hey, we're doing a rugby match up in Chicago this weekend. Fly up to Chicago Friday, find out as much about these teams as you can, and we're going to carry a rugby match on tape delay on Saturday. You're going to be the play-by-play guy. He said, have you ever done rugby before? And I said, no, but I've watched a lot of it on TV, which was probably 1/3 of a truthful statement. And I went up there. They gave me some analysts who knew all about the game, and it was sponsored by Michelob. Michelob was rugby, and then they'd send me to St. Louis, and I'd do bowling. Bowling was Bud Light. Or actually Budweiser. Soccer was Budweiser. They sent me to New Orleans. We did some pre-production and post-production on some speedboat races in New Orleans, and that was Bud Light. And so I got to do all these different sports through Anheuser-Busch because their different brands of beer were sponsoring these things. And then finally, after Tom Barton figured out that I wasn't lying about the fact that I was versatile, I could do different things, Anheuser-Busch signed a cable network on the air in 1984 called the Sports Time Cable Network. It was in 3 cities. It was in St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Kansas City. The St. Louis region would get the Cardinal games, the Kansas City region would get the Royals, and the Cincinnati region would get the Reds. And this network spawned several guys who would, later be big league announcers. And I was the Cardinal guy. They named me the Cardinal announcer. I worked with Mike Shannon. Jack Buck would come over for the middle 3 innings. Mike would go back to radio, and I'm sitting next to my boyhood idol, Jack Buck. Steve Fiziak, who's still an outstanding announcer with the Royals to this day, and has done things for ESPN and Fox. He was one of the Kansas City guys. Ken Wilson, longtime NHL great announcer, who also did the Cardinals later and did the St. Louis Blues. He was their guy in Cincinnati. So that's how I got my big break to break into Major League Baseball in 1984. Problem was the network, and we were doing like 52 games, because back then teams weren't doing that many home games. The owners still felt that televising home games would hurt the gate. So there were a limited number of home games on TV, so we did mostly road games. And problem was that network lost so much money. They lost the amount of money in 1 year that they were supposed to lose in 3 years, and Anheuser-Busch pulled the plug on the network, and I was one and done with my Cardinal job in St. Louis. I got to do some games filling in for Ken Wilson and for Jack and Mike Shannon on radio during the 1985 season. But the writing was on the wall for me in St. Louis. I had to go somewhere else to do baseball. So in 86, I auditioned and got a job with the Texas Rangers. I did 4 years with them. In 1988, ESPN hired me away from USA Network, where this wonderful man named Jim Zrake hired me to do U.S. Open tennis, Masters golf, college football, college basketball on USA Network. I even did some boxing for them, which I hated, but it was a paycheck and it was part of my job with them. And from that job, ESPN noticed me and hired me in 1988 to do football and basketball. And then after I lost the Rangers job at the end of the 89 season, ESPN added me to their Major League mix when they picked up Major League Baseball in 1980. And Norm Hitchcock and I did the first ever regular season baseball game on ESPN opening day, 1990. The Baltimore Orioles beat the Kansas City Royals at Royal Stadium in Kansas City. Sam Horn, their big slugger, hit a couple of homers into the fountain, and that was off and running with ESPN Baseball, which I did through the year 2005. So that's kind of how the whole baseball thing went. I eventually returned back to St. Louis in 95 and worked there till 05, mainly on TV, but I was doing the games on free TV, and most of the games were migrating to cable. They already had a cable crew doing those games, so I could see the writing on the wall. So with 1 year left on my contract in St. Louis, my agent, Alan Sanders, who's based in New York, he got me an opportunity to audition with the Washington Nationals. They flew me up. I interviewed at Mid-Atlantic Sports Network in Baltimore. They're headquartered in the warehouse there out in right field at Camden Yards. They drove me down to RFK, back to RFK Stadium, where I interviewed with the Nationals, and they hired me on March 1st, 2006, 1 month before the big league season started, and that was 13 years ago, so I'm getting ready for my 14th year with the Nationals.
All right, so I got two last questions for you, and I promise we'll put a nice exclamation point on this. This has been very, very intriguing, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your time.
No, it's been fun.
Okay, we'll see if these last two questions fit that category. So this, and I originally heard you. This is not. I'm not trying to sort of get into the process of broadcasting, and that's for folks like Joel Godet with his play-by-play cast, where I heard you a couple of months ago, which is an awesome podcast, by the way. If you haven't listened to it out there and you really want to get a sense of sort of the business of broadcasting, especially in the realm of sports. But it leads me to this question, and it's clear in all of the stories that you're sort of recounting here. It is a peripatetic life that one chooses when one goes into the broadcasting space for sports, right? Because it sounds like you're in many cases, and we kind of glossed over this, but you're doing multiple gigs simultaneously, if you will, right? This is not like you're going from one full-time job to another per se, right? And maybe right. That's we didn't even talk about your University of Oklahoma basketball coverage for many years and that kind of stuff. How does when did you sort of realize that was sort of the mindset of how to sort of be successful in this crazy business, is that you got to kind of keep your eyes open for things, even though things are going well now, right? And
you have to know a lot about what you do, But, I talked about that rugby experience. And Anheuser-Busch sent me to San Diego one time for a triathlon. I didn't know much about those guys, but I always consider myself a quick learner. And I think and the people at ESPN, I had a producer at ESPN. His name was Jay Rothman. I did football and basketball with Jay, and he always told me that I had the best. We called them boards. I called them charts, whatever you call them. Your preparation boards for basketball and football. And Jay would always tell me that I had the best boards in the business. And he even told Dick Vitale that. And one night we were working together, Dickie V said, "Bobby Carpenter, best boards in the business, baby." And we had fun with that. So I think I always had a sense, Tim, of how to prepare for events, what information was necessary, what information was maybe not that important. But I think also because I got such an early start in my career working in TV in 1978, because that game I mentioned at Giant Stadium when the Cosmos beat the Roughnecks, that was the first time I had ever appeared on television except for my final exam at UMKC, several years before that. Professionally. That was the first time I was ever on TV. So I got a good taste of television early in my career, and I think I got a sense of what it's like to have an expert analyst sitting next to you, because a lot of radio guys who do radio for a long time, they can have a problem transitioning over to TV, because on radio, you're it, and you might be going solo. And I did that, but I always found that I really enjoyed working with analysts who were, first of all, good guys, who didn't show up with an agenda, that they were going to be the superstar. They didn't care about anybody else. I really fed off my analysts, because I got to work with Billy Packer at CBS for some NCAA games, Dick Vitale, Bill Raftery, Larry Connolly, Jim Valvano, Jimmy Dykes, all these guys at ESPN that were big influence on me. Kevin Kiley early in my football career at ESPN. And I think what happened, and my baseball list of guys I've gotten to work with, it starts with Hall of Famers like Joe Morgan and Jim Palmer and Bob Gibson, and goes, all the way through the list. It's just these unbelievable guys who I had watched play. But I think, Tim, I developed the sense of how to make them feel good and how to make them feel that they were, the main cog in the show, which on TV, a lot of it is like that, where the analyst is the star. And I'm okay with that. I know play-by-play guys who did not have a good time with that because they wanted to be the show. I never wanted to be the show. I always wanted to be part of the team. And I think I developed a sense of how to work with those guys. And I just got a message through Twitter yesterday from Larry Sorensen, an ex-big league pitcher, who I probably worked 3 or 4 games with on ESPN like 20 years ago. And he just called me and said, "Hey, just wanted to send you a note. You're doing great. It was great working with you." And this is a guy that I worked with for maybe 2 months 20 years ago. You just develop a relationship with these guys, and the list goes on and on and on. And, Al Roboski and Ricky Horton in St. Louis, FP, Don Sutton, Ray Knight, Rob Dibble, Tom Paciorek in Washington, all these guys that become personal friends and lifelong friends. And I hope that I would hope that I have enough talent that I wouldn't be overmatched in any situation. But I've been told by people over the years that my preparation, but maybe most importantly, my ability to work with a lot of different analysts was a big part of my deal. Because when I was at ESPN, Tim, for whatever reason, I never became one of their big stars. But they gave Oral Hershiser to me when he broke in. They gave me Buck Showalter. They gave me Digger Phelps. They gave me other guys that were brand new analysts, and they said, "Hey, we'll give him to Carpenter because we know he'll take care of them. He's a team player, and he'll let them shine." And because of that, I've made lifelong friendships with all of those guys. Rick Sutcliffe was another guy that hadn't been on TV much, and they gave him to me. And I take great pride when I look up on a Sunday night game or a big ESPN game and I see those guys working. So I think that's a big part of it. It sounds really simple and really basic, but preparation and the ability to check your ego at the door and work with a lot of different people, I think it takes you a long way in my business.
All right, a quick tangent. You want to tell the audience about how you made a little cottage business for yourself with that preparation?
Well, in 1984, I'm doing the Cardinal games, and I have it in my cabinet here in my office, sitting 3 feet away from me. I have a scorebook from Buck's Sporting Goods in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in that scorebook from April of 1984 is my first Major League game at Dodger Stadium. Willie McGee hit a couple of home runs. The Cardinals beat the Dodgers. I think it was 11-7, something like that. And I'm working for a couple of months. I'm like, this scorebook just is not doing it for me. I wasn't aware of any other books out there. So I sat down in my hotel room somewhere on the road one night with 2 8.5 by 11 pages and my ruler, and I laid out what I thought a scorebook should look like. Whitey Herzog, who was managing the Cardinals back then, he gave me one of his blank lineup sheets. I had never seen a scorecard that had the bench guys and the available bullpen guys actually right there on the scorebook. So I decided to incorporate that into a regular scorebook configuration. You know, I tweaked it a lot over the years, and then I took it down to the local Jiffy print, had them put about 50 games worth of stuff in there, and I carried it around. It had a cardboard cover. It had this really bad plastic binding. And, you know, I'd be on the field somewhere, and I'd be down around the cage, and some play-by-play would walk up and say, "Hey, man, where'd you get that scorebook?" I said, "Well, I designed it. I made it myself." And a couple guys would say, "Well, how could I get one of those?" I tore the back page of the book out, handed it to him. I said, "Here, take this down the street to your Jiffy print and have them make it." Well, in 1995, and this is 11 years after I designed the book, somebody convinced me to go public with it, put it online. My wife and my daughter and I sat in my den one night, and we printed up a little brochure. We addressed brochures to every single A, double A, and triple A minor league baseball team in the country, addressed to their play-by-play announcer, and we got some pretty good response back. It's grown from then. There's now 2 different kinds of books: a big book for broadcast, a smaller book for fans, that I developed in 1998 because Cardinal fans were asking me, "Hey, we want to keep track of Mark McGwire's home runs, but your scorebook's too big to bring to the ballpark." So I designed a smaller book. That happened in 98. So, this past year we sold over 1,700 scorebooks, the most we've ever sold. And I don't know, never going to get rich off it, but it probably paid a couple of semesters of my daughter's college tuition along the way, so that's not a bad thing. But it's been fun, Tim, because I've had orders from Japan, Europe, the British Isles, South America, Central America, Puerto Rico. I hear from a lot of fans in Canada, fans of the Blue Jays who score games up there, old Expo fans. So, I guess it's become a bit of a cottage industry to a certain extent. And it's been a fun thing because it's probably gotten me some notoriety, but I've met baseball fans from all over the world, and that's always a good thing.
All right, and the website for that is, for our fans?
bcscorebook.com.
bcscorebook.com. Got that. All right, and here is the last question as we slide into home base. So we just had an episode last week about sort of some of the history of D.C. and baseball, which is surprisingly rich based from my sort of novice sort of perspective. So as the now longtime television and previous radio voice of the Nationals in Washington, how aware are you of that heritage, and do you feel in some respects almost like a caretaker of what is basically one of the earliest pro teams in all of baseball? I mean, Washington and baseball have a huge intersection over time. I wonder if you feel any sense of nostalgia and or caretaking, I guess, of the legacy of baseball in Washington D.C. As you broadcast their games.
Probably more caretaking than nostalgia because I didn't grow up there. But we've got I got a friend there, Phil Wood, who's the local baseball historian for all things baseball in D.C. In fact, every night when he signs off the air on the postgame show, he doesn't say adios, he says Eddie Yost. And so, Eddie Yost is one of those guys. And, you have all the – and it's been great. I've gotten to know Frank Howard a little bit over the years. Frank will show up at the ballpark, once or twice a year, and it's fantastic to talk old school baseball with him. Maybe more of a caretaker, but I'm aware of Bucky Harris and, of course, Walter, the Big Train Johnson, and all those guys. We got those flags on the scoreboard up in right field. There's a blank flag up there just waiting for the next World Series in Washington, D.C., because, the ones up there are from the 20s and, from that old era of baseball when the Senators, and Walter Johnson was the guy. They won one, but pretty soon it'll be 100 years if the Nats don't do it soon. So, yeah, definitely caretaking some of that. Try to be aware of it. The Nationals are their own team. We have some fans who don't even want to hear about their days in Montreal. I'd say most fans don't. Some do. But there's a lot of pride in D.C. now about the fact that after waiting 30-some years, they have their own team. And by the way, I never did radio in Washington. I want to pay respect to Charlie Slows, our radio guy, because Charlie's been there from day one. And I'll never forget something he told me, Tim. In 2005, the Nats had been on the road for the first week of the season. Then they came home, Livan Hernandez on the mound to face the Arizona Diamondbacks. And Charlie said as people came through the turnstiles, people were crying. They had tears in their eyes because baseball was coming back to Washington, D.C. So, that's something I try to remember because it means the world to our fans to have baseball back in the nation's capital.
Well, I'm not sure I got a tear in my eye, but I'm certainly I'm humbled that you would spend this much time with me regaling your path to what you're doing now. And I can't thank you enough, Bob Carpenter. This has been an absolute blast, and I appreciate you indulging me in some of the sort of memories of your earliest days in your career and how you got to where you are. And for your sake, I hope that in your broadcast career with the Nats, that you're able to fill in that last pennant there as a nice signature.
Yeah, we need to take that care of that. No, Tim, really, I enjoy talking sports, and it's been fun for me to take a step back. 31 years ago is when that whole thing started with the Roughnecks, and so it's been fun, and I appreciate you giving me the time, and I hope the folks listening enjoyed as much as I did it going through these things with you.
Well, that was just a fascinating chat, and I can't thank Bob Carpenter enough for taking time out of his spring training preparation for his, what is it now? I think it's coming up on his 14th year as being the television broadcaster for baseball's Washington Nationals. And I thank Bob tremendously for letting us drag him back, kicking and screaming probably, into some of his earliest days as a budding young professional broadcaster. And allowing us to go into our little annals here, our little nooks and crannies of forgotten sports history. I think that's kind of why we do these shows. It's a bit of an oral history about some of the people who were involved in these franchises, in these leagues, in these sports that for whatever reasons are no longer with us. And if you have those memories and want to reminisce or perhaps learn about some of the things that perhaps you forgot or didn't know about, or maybe you're just part of a new generation of sports fan and you kind of just woke up and realized that there was a whole sort of history behind maybe some of your favorite leagues or teams or even beforehand. And that's kind of why we do these silly little shows. And they're not that silly, really, if you get down to it. We just love learning and unearthing all kinds of interesting stuff. And Bob Carpenter certainly did not disappoint with some of those Steamers memories and Tulsa Roughnecks and NASL, and it's just amazing stuff. You heard Bob allude to his amazing invention, frankly, for anybody in the sports broadcasting business who doesn't know about this. Well, shame on you. And if you consider yourself a budding sportscaster and need sort of a cheat sheet, shall we say, to sort of help you up your game on the air. Or frankly, if you're a veteran broadcaster and just need a better way to sort of keep a handle on what's transpiring in front of you so that you can do your best over the airwaves. It's Bob Carpenter's Baseball Scorebook, and the address for that is bcscorebook.com. That's B as in Bob, C as in Carpenter. Get it, bcscorebook.com. That's where you can find out more information about Bob's career, as well as the story behind the invention of the go-to scorebook for anybody who considers themselves a pro in pro baseball broadcasting. And again, it's bcscorebook.com. And Let's see. I want to say thank you, of course, to all of our great listeners. We appreciate all of your input. Thank you for listening. As always, each and every week, make sure you go to our website to find out more about this show, as well as all the other shows that we've done and all the sort of links and all those kinds of things to keep abreast of what's going on with this little wacky program. And that's goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you're going to find all our social links, like at Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. There is a Facebook page devoted to our little show. You can check us out there. You can click to send us some email from our website. Of course, you can send that directly to us as well. That's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. It is also the place to sign up for our weekly newsletter. If you want to know what episodes are coming out and what kinds of things we've got planned for you, you can sign up for that there too. Let's see what else. Oh, and by all means, please go and rate and review our show, if you wouldn't mind, at Apple iTunes, Apple Podcast, whatever they're calling it this week. Anywhere, frankly, that you can leave or rate the show or leave a review. We can't thank you enough for doing that. It's got to be the least expensive way to show your love for this little show. And it helps other people find this program, and it does wonders, frankly. And when other people discover the show, we're more than happy to serve them, as we have you for all these many weeks, with further great programs and topics. And we can't wait to share with you the things that are coming up down the pike. A whole host of stuff and great interviews coming your way. But make sure you rate and review, will you? We couldn't appreciate that more. And last but not least, of course, you know him, you love him, you can't live without him. He is the good doctor, Jerry Payne. And we thank him and his friends at Podfly Productions for helping us with all of our editing and production needs. And you too can find out more about them and what they do in the world of podcasting at podfly.net. All right, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week. And until then, take care of yourselves and stay warm and dry. Bye-bye.
The MISL on ESPN has been brought to you by Budweiser, Beechwood Age, for that clean, crisp taste. This Bud's for you. This telecast has been a presentation of Anheuser-Busch Sports Productions through the facilities of ESPN.